lately I've been getting into, let's just say, a number of things, but one of those is the lineage of the controlling elite structure of this world. So I look at, let's say, these monarchies, these royals. I look at the European monarchy. And first I found that there was like certain connections, there was certain synchronicity amongst their lineage. Apparently, pre-World War One Europe, each supposedly independent nation or independent country, were basically being ruled by the same elite bloodline families. So I said, where do these families come from? And guess what? They all come back to bloodlines that were referenced in the Bible, very early in the Bible.
So there's this weird story of Noah after the ark and his son Ham, quote, seeing his nakedness while Noah was passed out drunk on wine. This earns a curse from Noah, and it's kind of like, well, he saw him naked. What's the big deal? So people have speculated there might have been more to it. But he doesn't curse Ham, his son who saw him naked. He curses his grandson, Canaan. Officially, nobody knows.
All right, so let's start there. His grandson, Canaan. See, a lot of people get this confused because when they hear about the Canaanites, people think about Cain and Abel, right? That's the Cain that they think of. But that's not the Canaanites that is being referenced in history. It's as this gentleman said, the line of the Canaanites goes back to Noah's son, Ham. Have you ever heard about the curse of Ham? Apparently, Ham did this thing after the flood and he pissed Noah off, and Noah placed a curse on his lineage, thus the Canaanites, right? So who knows what he did? Are these things metaphorical, allegorical? I used to think that between me, you, and the wall here. I'm thinking these things are less metaphorical and more literal as time goes on. As I've gone through my journey and I've discovered that the presentation of evolution, the presentation of scientism and history really comes down to a bunch of farcical illusions. I'm looking at these stories as more literal. So apparently we have the line of Canaan.
Nobody knows why. But Noah had two other sons, Japheth and Shem. And this is what Mullins writes about all this. In order to understand why the name of Shem was systematically reviled and concealed throughout the records of history, we must return the record to his thoroughly degenerate and evil nephew, Canaan. Canaan was so wicked his last will and testament to his children was a formula for vice. It read, love one another, that is, of this tribe only, love robbery, love lewdness, loathe your masters, and do not speak truth. This, Mullins says, comes from the Babylonian Holy Book. And basically that all things good come from Shem, all things bad come from Canaan.
All right, so look what it has here. You have to remember now. So let's go with the biblical flood story. You know, apparently Noah and his family were like the only survivors. Now, there's some contradictory information throughout the Bible regarding that, but let's just follow the story. So you had Japheth, Ham, and Shem. Notice that the line of Abraham and Sarah basically come right from Shem. So the line that we associate with the Israelites comes from the son of Noah named Shem. But it's this other son, Ham, that we see the Canaanites. And as this gentleman just described, they're typically given attributes much like the attributes we find when we examine the rituals and practices of these elite families. These dastardly, base, bacchanalian, deplorable type of behaviors. Apparently, this is coming from Ham and particularly his son Canaan.
Canaanites, or Phoenicians, employed their command of various monopolies to gain control of the commerce of the entire Mediterranean area.
All right, so he basically went on to say how the Canaanites became what we know today as the Phoenicians. All right, now the Phoenicians are regarded by history as a seafaring culture. It was a pre-Grecian culture. If you consider the Grecian culture to be in its peak around 500 BCE, The Phoenicians were historically around 500 to 1,000 years before that time. So somewhere around, let's say, 1000 BCE, you find the story of these Phoenicians. So he's basically making a link between this line of Canaan or the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. All right. So we're just going to cut to the chase here. He's then going to make a further link between the Phoenicians and the Venetians, which were separated by well over 1,000 years if you go by recorded history. Now, apparently, if you go by standard conventional history that they're going to give you in a textbook, they're going to tell you there's apparently no link between the BCE Phoenicians and the more recent pre-Renaissance Venetians, like the city of Venice, which to me strains credibility. And we're going to get more into it because we're even going to question here the 1,000-year difference. And many of you may be aware of this when we talk about the missing 1,000 years of the Dark Ages.
The most centrally located headquarters for all their operations was located on the Adriatic Sea. So here they founded the city of Venice, or Phoenicia. And I agree 100%. Officially, the Venetians of the Middle Ages aren't supposed to have anything to do with the ancient Phoenicians, even though all kinds of words from different language are just off by one letter, trade a B for a T, V for an F. But the Phoenicians were the merchants that controlled all shipping and trade in the ancient days, known for their shipbuilders and sailing vessels. Then a couple thousand years go by, and the Venetian Navy is the premier navy of the Mediterranean. But no, they have nothing at all to do with each other. Okay. The Venetians were known as masters of intrigue. They aided the Turks in the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, which was where the ruling class fled to after the fall of Rome. And they say lived there for an uneventful 1,000 years. Keep getting these phantom 1,000 years.
So, again, we're trying to link the current ruling elite class, the royalty, the monarchy that we've seen up to this modern time, and these biblical Canaanites.
Venice had now become the headquarters of a ruthless social climbing band of entrepreneurs who purchased titles for themselves or created them out of thin air, built splendid mansions, and collected the art treasures of Europe. They financed their new lifestyle with the enormous sums which they garnered from trade, piracy, and money lending. This group became known throughout Europe as the Black Nobility because
the Black Nobility. I want you all to remember that term, all right? Now, they're called the Black Nobility because even during their time, they were known to be linked to the line of Canaan, the so-called Canaanites. What is it about this line of Canaan? What could it be? These blue bloods? Is there something different about them? Is it a genetic difference? Is it just merely culture? But for whatever reason, we find that this ancient Phoenician culture apparently transformed some 2,000 years later, give or take, into the precursor to the ruling Renaissance families. That's where you see this Black nobility and the Venetians, like the city of Venice. So what is the link? Now, some have proposed, as I mentioned earlier, that the time frame given here is not exactly correct. That's where many conjecture a missing 1,000 years. You might be surprised to find out that there may have been a missing 1,000 years, or should I say 1,000 years that was added to our history. What was called the Dark Ages, which is basically from about 500 AD to 1500 AD, basically the fall of Rome to the birth of the Renaissance period. But either way, the story that we're being presented with here is that this so-called New World Order actually goes back to very ancient biblical bloodlines, which some, including myself, conjecture are maybe not human as we understand it. So if the Israelite line came from Shem and this Canaanite line came from his brother, what could the difference be there? It has been said, as was alluded to previously, that Noah cursed his son Ham because he saw his wife's nakedness. Some people conjecture that what that actually was a sexual interaction, and that when Noah was drunk in his drunkenness after the flood, that his son Ham actually committed incest with his own mother, Noah's wife. Could this line be bred of some ancient incestual genetic combination?
But they rapidly spread northward, setting up businesses and banking establishments in the northern cities of Italy. They bought more titles and intermarried with impoverished families of the old nobility. It's easy to look up the family tree of the blue bloodlines of Europe, and this looks like a whole lot of people, but we're talking less than 100 people over the course of 400 years, and they have definitely fashioned the modern world according to their ancient oaths. In Florence, the preeminent family was the de Medicis, who used their wealth to establish an academia which foisted humanism on the world. The de Medici established Florence as the European center of the nobility, also establishing close ties with the ruling families of England through the Savoy and Este families. Strangely,
all right, so as I said, now you have the presentation of the Renaissance period.
Heard about the amazing artwork and artists of the Renaissance, but this was a reinvention of society. Renaissance, and I know some will argue this, means a rebirth, not talked about quite as much as the revolution of thought that was occurring. Not only did they control the Church of Rome, but they controlled the opposition, the humanist movement, through the Platonic Academy.
All right, so what he presented there was very interesting to me, going back to how controlled opposition works. So he's presenting a situation in which these elite rulers were running the church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the emerging humanistic movement of the Renaissance. So again, it's the classic problem, reaction, solution, controlled opposition, play both sides, control your enemy by basically co-opting their movement, etc., etc.
Official history records this as being the time of the Black D. I've done many videos showing how there was much more than just a bug going around at that time. But no matter how you cut it, 2/3 of the world exited life and whole cities were up for grabs. Enter the Black nobility. Into the Dark Ages for 1,000 years, where they didn't write anything down, they didn't build any amazing structures, and to break their
So again, he's going back to the Dark Ages. So one of the things I'd like you guys to take away from this presentation is that the so-called Dark Ages may have never existed. This took me a while to wrap my head around it. This goes way deep. This goes into the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Many people think the 1,000-year reign of Christ has already happened and that we are exiting that now and moving into a new age. This gets really deep, but one of the takeaways would be the Dark Ages, the 1,000 years from 500 to 1500 AD, may have never existed. Do I have evidence for this? Of course not. Does anybody? Probably not. But when you look through history and you look for evidence of those 1,000 years, things are very sparse, to say the least.
He who controls international trade is at the top of the food chain. The Roman Navy controlled trade throughout the Mediterranean. They fell, and strangely enough, nobody reestablished these trade lines for 1,000 years, or wrote any books, or built any impressive structures. There's a saying that power abhors a vacuum, meaning if there's an empty space there at the top, somebody's going to fill it, but that didn't happen for 1,000 years. And then in the 1300s or so, the Venetians all of a sudden were excellent sailors and seamen, reestablished these trade routes. They colluded with their enemies, the Turks, to topple Constantinople because they wanted to topple the competition that was within their own ranks. Now, the Venetians only controlled trade in the Mediterranean, while the Turks to the east controlled all of the international trade between the east and the west. This is why there's still bitter rivals today. And there's one group you have all heard of that gained their wealth because they controlled the routes along the Silk Road.
And there's one group you all heard of because they controlled the routes on the Silk Road. Khazaria. And that's where our friends, the so-called Khazarian Mafia, comes in. There you have it, everybody. The link between the biblical Canaanites, the current ruling elites, the so-called black nobility, how power is achieved and maintained through trade routes, all the way to the link of modern times to the powerful Khazarian culture and today's elite banking groups